The rain fell with a cold, indifferent persistence, turning the asphalt of the downtown strip into a black mirror that reflected the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. It was a rain that didn't wash things clean, but instead seemed to press the city's grime deeper into its pores. Huddled in the shallow alcove of a boarded-up storefront, Elara felt the dampness seep into the threadbare wool of her coat, a garment that had lost its fight against the elements long ago. She was a ghost in the urban machine, a slight figure of 19 years made invisible by the city's relentless forward motion. Her world had shrunk to the space she occupied, a small pocket of misery buffered from the wind. In her hands, she clutched a small, tarnished silver locket, its surface worn smooth by the constant, desperate touch of her thumb. It was her only anchor in a world that had become a rudderless sea. The police station stood directly across the street, a squat brick monolith whose windows glowed with a sterile, unwelcoming light. It was meant to be a symbol of protection, of order, but to Elara, it was just another building whose doors were closed to her. Cars hissed by, their headlights cutting brief, sweeping arcs through the gloom, illuminating her for a fleeting second before plunging her back into shadow. She was just another piece of urban decay, easily ignored, easily forgotten. The front doors of the station swung open, spilling a wedge of harsh fluorescent light onto the wet pavement. Two officers, their forms bulky in their dark uniforms, emerged, laughing at some shared joke. They were Officer Miller and Officer Davis, men who walked with the heavy-footed certainty of those who believe the world is theirs to command. Miller was the larger of the two, with a thick neck that strained against his collar and a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer of casual contempt. Davis was leaner, younger, with a nervous energy that translated into a cruel sort of eagerness, a desire to impress his senior partner. They paused under the station's awning, surveying their domain. Their eyes scanned the empty street, skipping over trash cans and darkened windows, until they landed on the small, huddled shape in the alcove. The laughter died in Miller's throat, replaced by a sound of profound annoyance, a low grunt that was a dismissal in itself. "Look what the rain washed in," he muttered, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street. Davis snickered, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Gotta take out the trash before the sun comes up." Elara flinched, pulling her coat tighter, trying to shrink even further into the shadows. She didn't look up. She had learned that eye contact was an invitation, a challenge. To survive, she had to be nothing, a discarded wrapper, a puddle of rainwater. But they weren't going to let her be nothing. Their shift had just begun, and they were bored. With a shared glance that spoke of a long history of petty cruelties, they started across the street, their heavy boots splashing through the puddles, each step a drumbeat of approaching trouble. The world, for Elara, narrowed to the sound of those footsteps, the glint of their badges under the streetlights, and the cold, hard certainty of the locket pressed against her palm. The humiliation was coming. It always did. It was as reliable as the sunrise, and just as unforgiving. Her crisis was not the rain or the hunger gnawing at her stomach. It was the simple, crushing fact of her own visibility to men like these. Their shadows fell over her first, long and distorted, eclipsing the faint glow from the street lamp. Elara kept her head down, her chin tucked into her chest, hoping that if she didn't acknowledge them, they might lose interest and move on. It was a fool's hope. The smell of stale coffee and damp wool preceded them. Morning sunshine. Miller's voice was a gravelly parody of cheerfulness. "Bit early to be claiming the best spot on the block, isn't it?" Davis chimed in, circling her like a predator inspecting its prey. "Look at this. She's practically a part of the architecture. You payin' rent for this prime piece of real estate." Their words were sharp pebbles thrown at a window, designed to see what would crack. Elara remained silent, her knuckles white where she gripped the locket. The smooth, cool metal was her only reality, a talisman against the rising tide of fear. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her worn-out sneakers, the tear in the knee of her jeans, the matted state of her hair hidden beneath a thin beanie. Each observation was a judgment, a confirmation of her worthlessness in their world. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Miller leaned down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers. His breath was sour. "Or are you just too good to talk to us?" He nudged the toe of his polished boot against her leg. It wasn't a kick, not yet. It was a prompt, a physical assertion of his power over her. "We asked you a question still," she said nothing. Her silence seemed to infuriate them more than any screamed insult could have. It was a denial of their authority, a refusal to participate in her own degradation. For them, her compliance was part of the sport. Davis crouched down, his eyes narrowing on the object in her hands. "Whatcha got there? Hiding something?" Before she could react, his hand shot out and he tried to pry her fingers open. A surge of pure, primal adrenaline shot through Alara. She jerked back, clutching the locket to her chest with a fierceness that surprised them both. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. "Get away from me," she whispered, the words ragged and barely audible. The sound of her own voice was alien. Miller laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, it speaks, and it's got some fight in it. What's in your hand, little rat? Stolen goods? Drugs?" He straightened up, looming over her. "Under Section 24, I have the right to search you and your property if I suspect illegal activity. Now, are you going to show us what you're hiding? Or do we have to make this official?" The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Making it official meant being hauled into the station, processed, and thrown into a holding cell where she would be even more vulnerable. It meant losing the one tiny corner of the world she had, the relative anonymity of the street. They were cornering her, stripping away her options, all for a moment of cruel entertainment. The conflict wasn't about law or order. It was about power. It was about their need to feel big by making someone else feel small. And in that moment, Alara, with her worn coat and her silent defiance, was the smallest person they could find. They were denying her not just shelter or food, but her very humanity, reducing her to a problem to be managed, a piece of trash to be swept away. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, but beneath it, a tiny, defiant ember of her spirit refused to be extinguished. The cold metal of the locket against her chest was a conduit to another life. As Miller's condescending gaze bore down on her, the grimy alley faded, replaced by flashes of a world that was no longer hers. She saw a sun-drenched porch swing, her father's strong hands pushing her higher and higher until her laughter echoed through a garden filled with sunflowers. He was a large man, but his touch was always gentle, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He smelled of sawdust and Old Spice. He was the one who had given her the locket. "To keep you safe," he had said, his thumb tracing the intricate etching of an angel on its surface. "An angel for my angel." The memory was so vivid, she could almost feel the warmth of that summer sun on her skin, a stark contrast to the chilling rain now soaking through her clothes. The image shattered, replaced by another. She was in a garage, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and steel. Her father, his face streaked with grease, was working on the gleaming chrome engine of a Harley-Davidson. He wasn't just a carpenter. He was a mechanic, a healer of broken machines. Men with leather vests covered in patches would come to their house, their faces hard and weathered but their voices soft with respect when they spoke to him. They called him Doc. He wasn't a doctor of people, but of engines, the thrumming iron hearts of their bikes. They were his brothers, a loud, loyal, sprawling family that had always made her feel safe. They would lift her onto their shoulders, their long hair tickling her face, and tell her stories of the open road, of a freedom she could barely comprehend. The locket swung from her neck as she watched them, a silent silver witness to a life of belonging. Then came the fire. The memory was not a clear picture but a chaotic collage of sensation. The acrid smell of smoke, the searing heat, the terrifying crackle of wood being consumed. She remembered the color orange, a monstrous, hungry orange that ate her house, her room, her life. She remembered a fireman carrying her out, her small body wrapped in a coarse blanket. She remembered looking back and seeing her father, Doc, silhouetted against the flames as he ran back inside for her mother. Neither of them ever came out. The fire took everything, her home, her parents, her past. The only thing she had left was the locket, which the fireman had found on the lawn, its chain broken, its surface blackened with soot. She had spent weeks polishing it, rubbing away the dark stain until the silver angel beneath was visible again. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was the entire repository of her history, the last tangible piece of her parents' love. It was proof that she had once been someone, that she had been loved. This was the source of her quiet strength. She had already survived the worst thing imaginable. She had faced the inferno and walked out the other side, albeit scarred and alone. The taunts of two bored, cruel men were nothing compared to the roar of those flames. Enduring their humiliation was just another form of survival. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a shield forged in unimaginable loss. She had no words for them because they couldn't possibly understand the sacredness of what they were trying to take from her. Her spirit had been tempered in a crucible of grief, leaving behind a core of resilience they could not touch, no matter how hard they tried. The pressure intensified as Miller, impatient with her defiance, reached down and grabbed her by the arm. His grip was painfully tight, his thick fingers digging into her bicep. "I'm not going to ask you again," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "Show me what's in your hand." He began to haul her to her feet, the rough brick of the wall scraping against her back. The sudden movement and the sharp pain made her cry out, a small, choked sound of protest. A few early morning commuters were beginning to appear on the sidewalks, their faces hidden under umbrellas, their gazes fixed determinately forward. A man in a business suit slowed his pace, his curiosity piqued by the confrontation, but a quick, hard glare from Davis sent him scurrying on his way. A woman pushing a stroller across the street saw what was happening and quickly changed her direction, herding her child away from the unpleasant scene. Their silence was a form of complicity, a collective decision to not get involved. From the window of the diner next door, a weary-looking man named George wiped down the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. He had seen Alara huddled in the alley for the past few weeks. He'd even left out a cup of coffee for her once, when he thought no one was looking. He watched the two officers harassing her now, a knot of impotent anger tightening in his stomach. He knew Miller and Davis. He knew their reputation for bullying the weak and powerless. He thought about opening his door, about yelling something, but then he imagined them coming into his diner, finding some trumped-up health code violation, making his life difficult. He had a family to support, bills to pay. Fear was a powerful sedative. And so he kept wiping the counter, a silent, ashamed witness. Alara stumbled as Miller pulled her out from the alcove and into the full force of the rain. The cold water plastered her thin hair to her scalp and streamed down her face, mingling with the tears that now welled in her eyes. She refused to let them fall. She would not give them that satisfaction. She twisted in Miller's grasp, trying to break free, but he was too strong. Davis, seeing his partner struggle, moved in to help, grabbing her other arm. They were like two wolves toying with a trapped rabbit. The scene was laid bare for the whole street to see. Two armed officers of the law physically manhandling a homeless, unarmed teenage girl in the pouring rain. Yet the city remained indifferent. The cars continued to hiss by. The pedestrians continued to hurry along, their gazes averted. The community's silence was a deafening roar in Alara's ears, a confirmation of her complete and utter isolation. She was alone. No one was coming to help. This realization didn't break her. It hardened her. She stopped struggling, her body going limp in their grasp for a moment before she planted her feet firmly on the wet pavement. She raised her head, her jaw set, and looked directly into Miller's eyes for the first time. Her gaze was not one of fear or hatred, but of a profound, weary dignity. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose and had therefore become unbreakable. She would endure this, just as she had endured everything else. The rain could soak her, the cold could numb her, their hands could bruise her, but they could not touch the part of her that remembered the sunflowers and the sound of her father's laughter. In that tense, rain-soaked standoff, a sudden movement from the periphery broke the spell. A flash of matted brown fur darted from between two overflowing trash cans. It was a scrawny stray dog, a creature as lost and forgotten as Alara herself, its ribs showing starkly beneath its wet coat. Spooked by the shouting, it bolted directly into the street, its eyes wide with terror. At the same moment, a delivery truck, its driver oblivious and likely running late, barreled down the road, its heavy tires spraying sheets of water. Time seemed to slow down. George, the diner owner, saw it from his window, his hand freezing mid-swipe. The woman with the stroller, now a block away, turned at the sound of the truck's horn, a long, desperate blare. Miller and Davis, caught off guard, barely registered the impending collision. But Alara saw it all with perfect, heartbreaking clarity. She saw the dog's panicked eyes, the massive grille of the truck, the inevitability of the impact. In that split second, she didn't think. She acted. With a sudden, explosive burst of strength, she ripped her arm from Miller's grasp. He was so surprised by the force of it that he stumbled back a step. She didn't run from them. She ran towards the danger. She launched herself into the street, into the path of the oncoming truck. Her small frame was a blur of motion against the gray backdrop of the morning. "Hey!" Davis shouted, a meaningless sound lost in the screech of tires and the roar of the engine. Alara reached the dog and, without breaking stride, shoved it hard with both hands. The dog yelped, tumbling out of the truck's path and onto the safety of the opposite sidewalk. The selfless act saved the animal, but it cost her. She had no time to save herself. The truck's fender clipped her, not with the full force of a direct impact, but with enough momentum to send her spinning through the air. She landed hard on the asphalt, her head connecting with the pavement with a sickening thud. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of gray and black. The precious silver locket flew from her grasp, skittering across the wet road before coming to rest in the murky water of a storm drain, its delicate chain snagged on the grate. Miller and Davis stood frozen on the sidewalk, their mouths agape. Their petty game of intimidation had just escalated into something terrifyingly real. Miller let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. "Can you believe that? All that for a damn mutt," he said, his voice shaky, trying to reassert his cynical worldview over the shocking reality of what had just happened. But his words sounded hollow, obscene. Alara lay motionless in the middle of the street, the rain washing over her still form, her sacrifice a silent, powerful rebuke to their cruelty. The dog, safe on the sidewalk, began to whine, a mournful sound that cut through the city's drone. Alara's act of pure, instinctual compassion had irrevocably altered the morning, a selfless deed performed in a world that had shown her nothing but selfishness. The screech of the truck's tires had been a sound that fractured the morning's apathy. The driver, a young man with a pale, horrified face, slammed the vehicle into park and scrambled out, his hands shaking. "Oh my God! I didn't see her. She just ran out. Is she okay?" he stammered, his eyes wide with shock as he stared at Alara's still form. The fragile bubble of urban indifference had burst. The man in the business suit, who had hurried away moments before, now stopped and turned back, his face etched with guilt. The mother with the stroller had stopped, too, her hand covering her mouth as she watched. From across the street, George dropped his cleaning rag on the counter and threw open the door of his diner, the little bell above it jingling frantically. "Somebody call an ambulance," he yelled, his voice thick with a mixture of fear and fury. He glared directly at Miller and Davis, his earlier timidity burned away by the heat of the moment. "What are you two waiting for? Do something." Miller and Davis exchanged a panicked look. Their carefully constructed authority was crumbling. The small crowd of onlookers was no longer passive. Their gazes were now accusatory. The officers were no longer the ones in control of the narrative. They were the villains in a story that had just taken a tragic turn. Davis fumbled for his radio, his fingers clumsy, while Miller took a hesitant step towards Alara, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a pasty-faced anxiety. The shift was palpable. It was in the air, in the sudden, focused attention of the previously oblivious pedestrians. They had all been witnesses, not just to an accident, but to an act of profound courage. They had seen the two officers tormenting the girl, and then they had seen her risk her life for a creature even more helpless than herself. The contrast was stark, undeniable. A young woman in a hoodie, who had been waiting for a bus, walked slowly into the street. She ignored the truck, ignored the officers. She knelt beside the storm drain and carefully, gently, untangled the locket's chain from the grate. She held it in her palm for a moment, its silver angel seeming to gleam even in the dim light. She then walked over to where Ilara lay and, seeing her begin to stir with a low moan, knelt beside her. "You dropped this," the young woman said softly, her voice filled with a respect that had been absent just minutes before. She carefully placed the locket into Ilara's trembling hand. Ilara's fingers closed around it, a reflex born of deep, instinctual need. The feel of the familiar metal was a grounding force in a world that was spinning out of control. The whispers started then, rippling through the small crowd. "Did you see that? They were pushing her around. She saved that dog. Those cops didn't do a thing." The community, once a collection of disconnected individuals, was slowly cohering into a unified chorus of judgment. The shame that had been Ilara's burden was now being transferred, particle by particle, to Miller and Davis, who stood awkwardly on the periphery, their badges seeming to offer no protection from the silent condemnation of the people they were sworn to protect. The power dynamic had been completely inverted, not by a show of force, but by a quiet act of selfless love. Just as the first siren wailed in the distance, a new sound began to permeate the air. It started as a low, guttural vibration. A tremor felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It was a sound that made the plate glass window of George's diner hum. It grew steadily, multiplying, a deep-throated rumble that swelled into a thunderous roar, drowning out the approaching siren and the city's ambient noise. It was the sound of dozens, then scores, of high-displacement V-twin engines moving in perfect, menacing unison. Every head turned towards the source of the sound. From the west they came. A wave of chrome and black leather crested the hill and began to pour down the street. It was an occupation force. One motorcycle, a massive custom-built chopper, led the way, followed by two more, then a whole phalanx that filled the street from curb to curb. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating grace, their headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of a mythical beast. They were Hell's Angels. The iconic death's head patches on their vests were stark and unambiguous. There were not 10 or 20 of them. The procession seemed endless. 50, 100, 200 motorcycles flooded the downtown strip, their engines idling in a deafening, synchronized chorus that vibrated through the very asphalt. They formed a vast, impenetrable semicircle around the scene, their bikes creating a barricade of steel that sealed off the street. The ambulance, now arriving, was forced to stop at the edge of their formation, its flashing lights painting the grim-faced bikers in strobing hues of red and blue. The crowd of onlookers, which had felt so bold moments before, now shrank back, their murmurs silenced by a primal, instinctual fear. The bikers' sheer presence was an overwhelming display of power, a raw and untamed force that made the authority of the two police officers seem like a child's game. The lead rider cut his engine. The sudden pocket of silence was more intimidating than the noise. He swung a leather-clad leg over his bike and dismounted with the slow, deliberate movements of a man completely in command. He was a giant, his shoulders as wide as a doorway, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. A long, graying beard was tucked into his vest, and his eyes, deep-set and piercing, held an unnerving intelligence. This was Reaper, president of the charter. He removed his helmet, revealing a bald head, and his gaze swept over the scene, taking in the truck, the panicked driver, the cowed police officers, and finally, the small, broken figure of Ilara being tended to by the paramedics. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was a question, a demand for answers. He walked forward, his heavy boots clicking on the wet pavement, an emperor entering his court. The other bikers remained on their bikes, their engines a low, rumbling promise of violence, their collective gaze a palpable weight. They were a brotherhood, a tribe, and it was clear that they had not come by chance. They had been summoned, and they had answered the call. The balance of power on the street had shifted once more, this time with the finality of an earthquake. Reaper moved past the paramedics, who instinctively stepped aside for him. He ignored Miller and Davis completely, as if they were insignificant street furniture. His focus was solely on Alara, who was now sitting up on a gurney, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her face pale and streaked with rain. He knelt before her, a mountain of a man humbling himself before a wounded girl. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to his terrifying appearance, that it sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. "Ellie?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, yet surprisingly gentle. "Is that you?" Alara looked up, her vision still blurry. She saw the death's head patch, the weathered leather, the hard face, and for a moment, fear flickered in her eyes. But then she saw his eyes, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of recognition, of a shared history. He pointed a thick, gloved finger at the locket she was still clutching in her hand. "Your father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He gave that to you. He called you his angel." The words unlocked a memory deep inside her. A memory of the same man, years younger, sitting at her kitchen table, laughing with her father. He'd had more hair then and fewer scars. He had lifted her up and called her Little Bit. "Reaper?" she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. He nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "It's me, Little Bit." He turned his head slightly, his voice rising so that it carried to his men and to the silent, watching crowd. "This girl," he announced, his voice booming with authority, "is Alara. Her father was one of us. His name was Thomas, but we called him Doc." A murmur went through the ranks of the bikers. The name Doc was legendary among them. "Doc was our brother," Reaper continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd and finally landing, like a physical blow, on Miller and Davis. "He was the best mechanic we ever had. He could bring an engine back from the dead. More than that, he was the heart of our club. He pulled 3 of our brothers out of a burning wreck on the interstate. He saved their lives. He saved my life." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "A fire took him and his wife from us a few years back. We thought we lost everything that day. We thought his line was ended." He looked back at Alara, his expression softening. "We were wrong." He reached out and gently took the locket from her, holding it up for his men to see. This was his. He carried it for luck. It's got a St. Christopher medal inside. Doc gave it to his daughter, his only child, to keep her safe. The reveal landed with the force of a thunderclap. This wasn't just some homeless girl the cops were harassing. This was the daughter of a hero. She was biker royalty, the orphan child of a fallen brother. The Hells Angels hadn't come for a stranger. They had come for family. Miller's face had gone from pale to a ghastly shade of gray. He looked at Davis, whose own expression was one of pure, unadulterated terror. They hadn't just bullied a homeless girl. They had desecrated the memory of a man these bikers revered as a saint, and they had harmed his legacy, his flesh and blood. The full truth of the situation settled over the street, a heavy, suffocating blanket of consequence. Alara was not alone. She had never been alone. She just hadn't known that her family, her fierce, loyal 200-strong family, was just a phone call away. The air crackled with a new and dangerous energy. The recognition of who Alara was transformed her in the eyes of everyone present. She was no longer a victim. She was a symbol. Reaper stood up, turning to face his men. He held the locket aloft. "Doc's daughter," he roared, and the response was instantaneous. 200 engines revved in a deafening salute, a unified cry of loyalty and acknowledgement that shook the very foundations of the buildings. The sound was a declaration. "She is one of us. She is protected." Reaper then turned back to Alara. In a gesture of profound significance, he began to unbuckle his own vest, the heavy leather kilt that was the embodiment of his identity, his rank, and his life's commitment. It was adorned with patches that told the story of his years with the club. The death's head on the back, the charter name, the flash of his position as president. Taking it off in public was unheard of. He held it for a moment, then leaned down and gently draped it over Alara's small shoulders. The vest was huge on her, swallowing her frame, its weight a heavy, comforting presence. It smelled of leather, gasoline, and the open road. It smelled like her father's garage. Smelled like home. The sight of the club president's colors on the shoulders of the homeless girl was a powerful, symbolic coronation. It was a transfer of status, a shield of honor. It declared to the world that an injury to her was an injury to them all. One by one, other bikers began to dismount. They didn't speak. They simply moved, forming a solid wall of leather and denim between Alara and the rest of the world, their bodies a living fortress. They turned their backs on the police, on the crowd, facing inward toward her, creating a private, protected space. The community, shaken from its stupor, began to act. George, the diner owner, emerged from his doorway carrying a steaming mug of hot chocolate and a thick wool blanket, which he handed to one of the bikers to pass to Alara. The woman with the hoodie who had retrieved the locket returned with a first aid kit from her car. The man in the business suit, his face flushed with shame, approached one of the bikers and pressed a handful of cash into his hand. "For her," he mumbled. "Please, just make sure she's taken care of." The bikers didn't accept the money, but the gesture was noted. The fear the Hells Angels inspired was being replaced by a grudging, awe-filled respect. They weren't there for chaos. They were there for justice, their own brand of it. The police chief had arrived now, a man with a weary face and panicked eyes, trying to make sense of the army of bikers that had occupied his town. He approached Reaper, his hand held out tentatively. Reaper ignored the hand. He looked past the chief, his gaze locking onto Miller and Davis, who were trying to make themselves small behind their patrol car. Reaper's voice was quiet, but it cut through the idling engines with chilling precision. "Those two," he said, pointing a single damning finger. "They put their hands on the daughter of a brother. They dishonored her. They dishonored him." The chief's face hardened. He understood the message perfectly. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a final statement. The recognition was complete. Alara, who had started the day as a piece of invisible refuse, was now the most important person on the street, the protected ward of the most feared brotherhood in the state. The final act unfolded not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable weight of consequence. The police chief, a man who understood the delicate and often violent politics of his town, looked at Miller and Davis with undisguised disgust. He knew he had a choice: stand by his two rogue officers and risk a war with the Hells Angels, or cut them loose and restore some semblance of order. It wasn't a choice at all. "Miller, Davis, badges and guns on my desk. You're on administrative leave, pending termination," he said, his voice clipped and final. The two officers looked stunned, then defeated. Stripped of their authority in front of the entire town, their humiliation was now absolute. They were escorted away by a pair of their own, their heads bowed in shame. Reaper watched them go, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to Alara. The paramedics had checked her over. She was bruised and had a mild concussion, but she was fundamentally all right. She refused to go to the hospital. She just wanted to leave. "We'll take care of her," Reaper told the paramedics, a statement that allowed no argument. He helped Alara to her feet. Still wrapped in his massive vest, she looked small and fragile, yet a new light shone in her eyes. It was the light of someone who had just remembered they were not alone in the universe. A younger biker, one with a prospect patch on his vest, brought his own bike forward. It was cleaner, newer. Reaper nodded his approval. This bike would be for Alara, not to ride on the back, but to own. The keys were placed gently in her hand. The message was clear. She was not a passenger in her own life anymore. She was being given the means to ride her own path, with her entire brotherhood riding behind her. The bikers began to mount their motorcycles, the process methodical and disciplined. The stray dog, which had been hiding under a car, trotted out and sat by Alara's feet, as if it understood that its fate was now tied to hers. One of the bikers grinned, producing a piece of beef jerky from his pocket and tossing it to the dog. A name was decided on the spot, Doc, in honor of her father. The closure was a slow, majestic procession. Reaper climbed onto his own chopper and started the engine. The sound was a signal, and one by one, the other 200 engines roared back to life. The sound was no longer menacing. It was triumphant. It was the sound of a family reunited, of a promise kept. Alara, with help from a biker, mounted her new bike. She didn't know how to ride, but that didn't matter. One of the angels would ride it for her for now, with her safely on the back until she was ready. She looked back at the town, at the faces in the crowd, at George standing in his diner doorway, who gave her a small, respectful nod. She saw a community transformed by the events of the morning, a town that had been forced to look at the person they had ignored and see the hero she truly was. With Reaper in the lead, the convoy began to move. It flowed like a river of steel, pulling away from the curb and onto the open road. Alara was in the center of the formation, a precious cargo surrounded by a phalanx of her protectors, the dog now safely tucked into a custom-built carrier on one of the bikes. As they rode out of town, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows behind them. The light glinted off the chrome, off the silver of the locket which now hung securely around her neck, and off the tears of gratitude that finally streamed down Alara's face. The roar of the engines was the sound of her future, a powerful, unwavering anthem of loyalty, respect, and belonging. She was no longer a ghost. She was the daughter of a Hell's Angel, and she was finally going home.